Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session of the Global Campus for Sustainable Development Goals, in which we will reviewing the contributions of forest landscape to Sustainable Development Goals. In this session, we will focus on land use planning, and specifically, we will adopt an optimization approach to analyze this problem. My name is Pablo Yapura, and I am a professor at the National University of La Plata in the Faculty of Agricultural and Forest Science, where I am in charge of forest management and introduction to operations research courses. In this presentation, in the first section, we will address or review the concepts of land use and land use change and the different perspectives that exist regarding this problem. Then, in the second section, we will present land use planning as an optimization problem, specifically, and we will classify it into one family of mathematical programming problems. In section 3, we will take an example from a recent paper that solves a regional land use planning problem with an eye on climate change, and we will reproduce it in a general purpose programming language to get a computer solution. In the final section, we will review the links or relationships we can establish between Sustainable Development Goals and land use planning, particularly the contribution that this human activity can make to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, in the final section, we will present the bibliographic references for the whole presentation. In this section, we will present a set of formal definitions of land use and also of land use change, a distinction that has become more substantial in the context of discussions about climate change. But before doing so, we will present a set of specific considerations about land use and the forms that land use change has taken in recent decades to give this definition a bit more of meaning. Before moving on, a clarification is in order. From this slide onward, it should be understood that whenever a reference is included in the slide title, most of the text on the slide is a literal quote from the referenced work. Now, returning to the slide at hand, the specific reference was selected because it comes from the beginning of this century. Turner reminds us that the human influence on the global biota can already be noticed in events as ancient as the mass extinction prior to the last ice age, and also in the global transformation of the biota brought about by the overseas trade even before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. As it is well known, biota is critically dependent on land use. Therefore, the author also quantifies a series of more contemporary influences, of which we have selected just a couple for illustrative purposes. Today, it is considered that there is no fraction of the earth that has not been altered in some way by human influence. That is, there are no longer any pristine or virgin areas in the sense of areas free from human influence. And more than half of the ice-free land is considered significantly affected by human activity. We will quantify better these facts further later. It is also estimated that 1/3 of the increase in greenhouse gas concentration that have accumulated since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution is due to land use changes, primarily the expansion of agricultural frontiers or deforestation. In short, all these observations motivated the author to advocate for an integrated land change science, capable of addressing problems of land use, a problem whose severity could be inferred from some forecast of the trends expected for this century. Remembering that these forecasts were formulated at the beginning of this century, we reviewed with Turner some of the expected trends in 4 land use categories that are typically used to describe these processes on a global scale, referring to forest land, pasture and rangeland, agricultural land, and land with urban and industrial development, both in the same category. In forest land, the deforestation already evident in the tropics was anticipated to continue well into the century. This process would also be accompanied by alteration in tropical forests without implying changes in land use. For this reason, Turner termed these changes as cryptic and anticipated them to be difficult to detect, but which would be important anyway because they could be associated with degradation of these ecosystems in the tropics. In boreal and temperate climates, an increase in forest areas was anticipated well into this century, although with the noted exception of Siberian forests, where potentially large-scale deforestation was predicted, but driven by the use of these lands by the forest industry rather than by the expansion of the agricultural frontier, as is the case in the tropics. Regarding lands covered by pastures and grasslands, Turner points out that at the beginning of the century there was no global consensus in the scientific community on trends to be expected in this type of land. Although a significant change could be anticipated, a significant increase in degradation of lands covered by grasslands on a global scale, they were not as worrying in terms of desertification as certain statements at the beginning of this century suggested. For agricultural lands, and particularly in medium and high-income economies, an intensification of productive activities concentrated on a few crops, the commercially important ones, was expected. This intensification would be based on high input use and an increasing use of technology. In these economies, a shift from marginal productive activities to other land use was also expected. Meanwhile, in less developed economies, an expansion of cropland and pasture land was expected, especially in the tropics, where species invasions were anticipated to pose a significant challenge to these lands. For urban and industrial lands, an increase in what is known as the ecological footprint of land use was expected, including its influences and impacts on biogeochemical cycles through pollution processes, which are predominantly local and regional in scope. Besides, the expansion of urban and industrial lands was also expected to occur at the expense of croplands. To contrast these trends we have just reviewed with what has actually happened in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, let's review the main results of 2 research papers that have attempted to quantify these processes. In the first one, the author's central concern has been to quantify land management, which we will equate with land use, although they are not necessarily exactly the same. These authors have used 10 different categories, which is unusual, and in this slide we review the definition of the first 5 of those 10 categories, simply to highlight that forested land use or land covered by forest in this paper is represented by the first 2 categories of the table, and the same is true for agricultural land use, which is also represented by 2 categories, the 2 last ones in this part of the table. Between these categories in the table we can see the livestock use of lands, which is the other term commonly used to refer to land covered by grassland and pasture. To complete the presentation of the categories these authors have used to describe land use, we present the last 5 categories in this table. In this case, we just highlight that 3 of them, namely nitrogen fertilization, soil tillage, and irrigation, correspond to specific uses of agricultural land, as if they were subcategories of croplands. The main results of this work are presented here. On the left, on the graph, it can be seen that livestock land use, that is, land covered by pastures and rangelands, constitutes the most widespread use on a global scale, followed in second place by forestry and land covered by forest, and croplands comes in third. It is also worth noting that in this graph it is not possible to zoom the length of all the bars, since irrigated, nitrogen fertilized, and plowed lands occur substantially within croplands, as already noted. The graph also displays the intensities with which activities are carried out in each of these land use categories, showed in different shades of gray. Some important data on intensity have been included in the tables on the right. Within each category, the proportion of land used with high intensity is very low in forest lands and grazing lands, while in agricultural land it is a very significant fraction. Meanwhile, land use with low intensity accounts for practically the same proportion within each of these three categories, implying that high intensity in agricultural land use occurs at the expense of medium intensity rather than low intensity. At the global level, consolidating all the values, what can be observed is that nearly 9% of the total land uses use high intensity models, highlighting, of course, that this happens primarily in agricultural lands. Lands used with medium intensity represent 2/3 of the total, while the remaining quarter is used with low intensity models. In the second study, we selected to contrast the trends noted at the beginning. The emphasis has been on quantifying changes in the land use. Indeed, these authors review the changes that have occurred in 6 different categories of land use. Not all of them are consistent with those we have used so far, but we can use cropland, pastureland, and forestland, which are the ones that interest us most, to quantify what is happening. Also, in this paper, the time window extends from 1960 to 2019. That is, the last 40 years of the 20th century and the first 20 years of the 21st century. According to these authors, when they account for the area of land use change that has occurred at least once in this time period, it has occurred in 17% of the Earth's surface. And when more than one change is considered, the change has covered approximately 1/3 of the Earth's surface. That is, it has represented a significant proportion of the world's lands. They also observed that forests have grown. That is, their area has increased in the global north, including China, because this author considered China to be part of the global north. Meanwhile, in the global south, forest area has declined sharply. This is in contrast with changes that have occurred in agricultural land. While agricultural land has decreased in the global north, agricultural land has increased its share in the global south. And regarding pasture land, the changes are less pronounced because most of these changes have occurred in one country in the global north and another one in the global south, always within the context of this study. We emphasize that both countries have large territorial areas. To quantify the acceleration of land use change, these authors developed the graph presented here. In the time window from 1960 to 2020, 2 distinct processes can be observed, clearly differentiated over time when analyzed on a global scale. The first runs from 1960 to 2004, during which land use change shows increasing rates, while from 2005 to the present days, the rates of change are noticeably decreasing. In the following slide, we will present the causal explanation for these two distinct processes. To represent the geographic distribution of these rates of change, graphs are presented for 6 particular subcontinents. To give an idea of how the calculations were made, the accompanying world map shows these 6 subcontinents in different shades of gray. Here, we present the causal explanations for the two periods of phases outlined in the previous slide. The increasing rates of land use change observed towards the end of the 20th century coincided with the rise of the Green Revolution, which entailed an intensification of agricultural activities and the growing use of inputs and technology in agricultural production. Moreover, this intensification was subsequently aided by the globalization of food markets, which was observed primarily beginning in the 1990s. These authors then postulate that market globalization was a major factor in land use change, and this particularly explains deforestation for the production of commodity-sized crops in the Global South. This shift in land use change from the Global North to the Global South is evident in the increasing proportion of cropland devoted to production for international markets rather than domestic consumption observed in many countries. In this regard, Argentina, my country, is perhaps a paradigmatic example. Furthermore, the authors also point out that the slowdown observed over the last 15 years or so, which saw a shift from increasing to decreasing rates of land use change, may also be driven by global markets. Specifically, they point out that the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009 could explain the slowdown in land use change, which can be seen in decreasing pace of the agricultural frontier expansion in many countries in the Global South that were cultivating crops to supply international markets. Finally, the authors also point out that climate change and its associated impacts are another factor to consider, one whose importance will increase in the future, given the more frequent occurrence of extreme events such as droughts and floods. The following two slides have been included primarily as an excuse to introduce this important work entitled Global Land Outlook. This work is considered the flagship of the works carried out by the international community centered around the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, and its first edition dates back to 2017. An update was published in 2022, and as I mentioned, it synthesized the Convention's vision of the problem of desertification on a global scale, and also channels the efforts of the international community to develop an agenda to prevent the evils of desertification on the global scale. This slide is simple to review the key messages from the first edition of the work, which refers to the fact that pressure on land use has reached enormous level and that this pressure has continued to increase in recent years. A significant proportion of natural managed ecosystems are being degraded, which combined with biodiversity loss and climate change increases the risk of a serious land use crisis. Land degradation also implies severe limitation in the resilience of environmental stress. It also obviously highlights the huge number of human beings associated with lands primarily used for subsistence agriculture, which are already degraded or are on the way to becoming so in the near future. On the other side, the consensus on this community is that the food production system is already broken and is beginning to threaten the health of the human population, as well as the environmental sustainability of our planet. This is compounded by the extreme dissociation between food production and consumption patterns, exacerbating most of all the degradation processes, such as those just described. This is also essentially a consequence of the agribusiness model linked to the food production that exists on a global scale, in which a great asymmetry prevails, as only a minority benefits, and this occurs at the expense of the well-being of the majority of the human population. It is also highlighted as part of the consensus that the problem of land tenure and ownership has only worsened dramatically in the last 20 years, that is, during this century. To complete this brief review of the key messages of the Global Land Outlook, we have summarized the international community's view on one key question: whether all the world's land, even though it is a scarce resource with a finite amount of availability, would be enough to satisfy present and future human needs in every sense. That is, in terms of food, but also in terms of environmental services. In this community's view, this is perfectly possible. The available land can be sufficient in the long term, both to cover food needs and to provide essential ecosystem services, as long as more efficient land planning and use models are adopted. This is a key part of the message promoted by this community, and this can be seen in a little more detailed way by delving into the issue of the land use planning. A substantial part of the vision is based on the idea of trade-off solutions, attempting to achieve balances between all the goods and services demanded from land use. And within this international community, linked, I insist, to the Convention to Combat Desertification, the notion of land degradation neutrality has been developed. This notion will be reviewed in a little more detail shortly after, and we will provide a slightly more elaborate idea at the end of this presentation. So, with this, we have finished presenting the issue of land use, quantifying several historical processes, and are now ready to review some very relevant definitions of land use to establish the context of our contribution within this session. In this closing of the first section, we present a definition of land use planning, taken from another important work derived from the efforts of the community associated with the Convention to Combat Desertification. However, this time the text is not an official text of the Convention, but rather work commissioned by the Convention itself, but to serve as a roadmap for better understanding all aspects related to land use planning. And that will be our final recommendation. Use this text for that purpose, to serve as a roadmap for understanding the topic. The definition, as I mentioned, recaps the most important aspects of land use planning. On the one hand, it says that it embraces a systematic assessment of land and water potential, explicitly identifying the different possible alternatives for the use of the same piece of land, and establishing the social and economic conditions under which the selection of the best land use option should happen. I emphasize the notion of best option because it is a concept we will explore later and is closely linked to optimization, the approach adopted for this session. The purpose of selecting these lands, on the other hand, is to implement after planning those land uses that best meet needs. Again, the idea of best satisfaction or best fulfillment of an objective is an important notion in the field of optimization, while also guaranteeing resources for the future. The latter is also perfectly consistent with the ideas of optimization, in which guarantees are usually provided by specifying restrictions or conditions that the best identified solution must meet. We conclude the first section, therefore, by highlighting that there is no single definition of land use and that many definitions have proliferated in the recent past, each emphasizing a key aspect, such as those highlighted in this graph and in this itemized summary presented here. There is an entire field of land use planning in which spatial aspects are centrally considered, which is very important when implementing the best solutions identified on the ground. Participatory approaches to solving land use planning problems have been recognized only recently, especially in the last quarter of the 20th century, or just a bit longer, because prior to that time, land use planning problems were considered a field reserved for technicians and experts. Currently, this idea has been abandoned, and citizen participation is privileged in all processes linked to land use planning and the implementation of the best selected option. This is precisely why there is a branch of land use planning that emphasizes the participation of local communities and the general public. On the other side, land use planning has always been recognized as an essential aspect of environmental policy. In general, it constitutes an environmental policy tool, and this is what another subdisciplinary field of land use planning emphasizes. We also highlight the line of interest that focuses on the integrality of the approach, that is, encompassing all objectives and demands that the solution must satisfy to be realistic. The last definition we have highlighted is one that has been very popular in recent years, particularly in the Latin American context. Planning with a territorial focus and with an ecological component, as highlighted in this definition, includes biophysical, cultural, socioeconomical, sociopolitical, and institutional characteristics as contingent factors in the selection of best uses when making decisions and implementing them. And then with this, we conclude our conceptual review of land use planning and remind ourselves that this is nothing more or less than a roadmap for exploring this broad disciplinary field. From now on, we will focus on a more specific aspect of the problem, the optimization approach to solving specific planning problems. In this second section, we will approach land use planning problems as optimization problems. First, we will characterize optimization and mathematical programming, the two main terms used for this field. At the end of the section, we will present several ways in which these ideas, these theories, have been and continue to be applied to land use planning problems. To better understand land use planning as an optimization problem, we have selected these four references to present a series of relevant or important concepts. In the first definition, we characterized land use planning problems as belonging to the type of problems known in the field of optimization as resource allocation problems. Specifically, in this case, or in the case at hand, the problem can be defined or conceived as a problem of allocating different possible activities or uses to specific units of land in a specific geospatial context. And since sustainability in the broadest sense, which is the goal pursued today in land use allocation, requires achieving a long-term balance between economic development, environmental protection, efficient use of resources, and social equity, the purpose of this type of problem is to find a solution that constitutes a balance between these multiple objectives that are being optimized simultaneously. This is the idea of the first definition. Since we have presented the idea of multi-objective optimization, let's break it down into its constituent parts. Multi-objective programming, on the one hand, is the branch of mathematical programming that deals with decision problems characterized by multiple objective functions. These are multiple and conflicting, typically, in the sense that an improvement in one objective implies a deterioration in the other objectives. Multi-objective programming is a branch of optimization that has undergone significant development in recent years. This is why we have selected this reference from a very important author in this field. On the other hand, we have talked about mathematical programming, so we are also going to turn to a very classic text by the father of linear programming. He defines mathematical programming or optimization theory, those are the words he used, as a branch of mathematics that deals with techniques for minimizing or maximizing an objective function, subject to linear, nonlinear, or integer constraints. The latter is what defines the type of problems and can also be present in multi-objective programming, where we can find linear, nonlinear, or integer functions among the multiple objectives and several constraints. Another subdisciplinary field frequently associated with the optimization of land use problem is what is known as multi-criteria decision analysis. Many authors also consider it part of mathematical optimization, although this perspective is not always agreed upon by authors. Here we have revisited a definition of multi-criteria decision analysis simply to highlight that it is highly consistent with previous definition of optimization, although a mathematical bias predominates among them. As you can see, the ideas of a trade-off solution or appropriate balance between the performance achieved among the different objectives pursued when planning land use are also mentioned here. Here we present a classification of different techniques for addressing the problems that interest us, but from the perspective of multi-criteria decision analysis, that is, emphasizing the role on decision support, which is what DS stands for in this slide. As can be seen in the graph on the left, there are qualitative methods, quantitative methods, and hybrid methods. The idea of qualitative method is self-explanatory. They generally dispense the quantification of relevant processes, and a couple of examples of techniques from this family are offered there. In the case of quantitative method, in addition to the classic and well-known cost-benefit analysis widely used in the second half of the 20th century, other techniques are currently preferred, collectively referred to as multi-criteria decision analysis. As you can see there are multi-attribute decision models as a separate family from multi-objective decision models. In this presentation, we will focus on the latter and present the characteristics that distinguish them according to the emphasis of each approach. The last family of quantitative methods presented emphasize the ability of deal with uncertainty when making decisions and is probably the most recent evolution. On the other hand, the graph of arrows pointing to the right is a representation of the many possible ones, highlighting the sequential nature of the planning process. It serves as an excuse to highlight that the models we are discussing, the models that interest us, are located somewhat between the modeling and optimization of land use planning problems. Thus, the implementation of optimal solutions, which is putting into practice what was decided as a good plan, is a subsequent problem and can almost always be separated. And of course, everything prior to modeling, which consists of explicitating the scale of values of the problem, is basically one of the most relevant aspects of the process. I emphasize that in this sequencing, we will focus on problem modeling and how to obtain optimal solution, testing those models that present our decision problem and assuming everything that is needed before and after. Here we present a mathematical formalization of the multi-objective or multi-criteria optimization problem, according to the definition we have been reviewing. In principle, it's not necessary to devote too much time to fully understand this expression. We simply leave them here so that those of you who are more interested can delve deeper later. Here, we will simply emphasize that these optimization problems are made up of several objective functions. Although maximization is also possible, the mathematical notation here is the simultaneous minimization of all relevant objective functions, and consequently, their combinations creates a multidimensional objective space, as it is technically called. Typically, there are between 2 and 5 objectives, that is to say, dimensions of this objective space. So, although this number can be significant, it is usually not very large. On the other hand, the decision space, which is the space made up of the decision variables as a mathematical representation of the activities that have been planned as part of the planning process, is also a multidimensional space called the feasible set. It can typically be very, very large, that is, n in this notation can be a big number. The other part of the optimization model that is important to clarify is the constraints. That is why we added at the end that the feasible set is usually expressed as inequalities plus equations, and there is a mathematical expression of what we are saying. They are the limits that operate for the decision variables if we want to form or constitute a feasible, that is, realizable decision. We have mentioned the notion of a trade-off solution many times. Here, we will attempt to clarify it a little bit more in the field of the multi-objective optimization. These types of solutions are usually represented mathematically with the concept or notion of the Pareto frontier, in honor of the well-known Italian economist of the late 19th century or early 20th centuries. In the context of multi-criteria optimization, solutions on the Pareto frontier are a set of solutions rather than a single solution, among which it can be observed that the performance of an objective function cannot improve without implying a deterioration in the remaining objectives. That is, one objective can only improve at the expense of sacrificing the other objective. From this perspective, solutions on the Pareto frontier are considered efficient and therefore a good expression of what constitutes a trade-off solution. This is why many of the solution methods, many of the algorithms used to find the solution to the multi-objective problems also try to find this set and also to find a way to visualize it. Above all, because it is a very communicative expression of trade-off. In this regard, we have included on the right an example taken from the second reference in the title, which proposes a global-scale land use planning problem. In this problem, the Earth's surface has been subdivided into a grid of 1 degree of latitude by 1 degree of longitude, and each cell of this grid is to be assigned one of 3 intended uses to maximize performance in 3 objectives: carbon sequestration, freshwater provision, and food production. The Pareto frontier for this problem is presented in the upper left, with the solution colored in green for projections toward the end of the 20th century, under a low emission scenario for climate change. The current situation, that is in 2017, is presented with the red diamond for contrast. The rest of the graph presents the land use allocation of the Earth's major biomes. It can be seen that, in general, the optimal allocation consists of preserving tropical and boreal forests, while temperate regions should be primarily dedicated to pasture and food production. We emphasize that this is just an example of how multi-objective, multi-criteria solutions, which are usually characterized as efficient because they lie on the Pareto frontier, are depicted. Here, we present a set of important ideas regarding solution methods for these problems. In general, there are 2 basic approaches. One is scalarization methods, and the other is Pareto-based methods. In scalarization methods, all objective functions are combined into a single function, which can then be modified to normalize the physical units for each objective. A weighted sum of all objectives is then maximized or minimized, with the relative importance between objectives explained using the weights. Quantitative goals can also be established for each objective, and deviation from these quantitatively established goals can be minimized. Scalarization methods do not automatically provide the Pareto frontier, so obtaining it can be challenging when using them. However, they do allow for a solution to the problem with multiple criteria. On the other hand, Pareto-based methods provide the optimal solution to the problem and the Pareto frontier, thus providing both products, but are more demanding from an algorithmic and computationally point of view. Regarding the mechanisms used to obtain solutions, we will mention that many of the methods, especially those based on Pareto, use algorithms popularly known as heuristics. We provide a series of examples here. They are termed as local search because they do not guarantee finding the global optimal solution, an important concept in optimization theory. These heuristic methods are also applicable to scalarization methods, but when the problem conditions allow it, exact algorithmic methods can be used, such as the classic simplex method used to solve linear programming problems, whether it is integer or continuous, which is not very relevant for the purposes we are describing. To conclude our brief presentation of solution methods, here we expand slightly on the definitions given for Pareto-based methods, which we already stated are generally heuristic methods that do not guarantee finding the global optimal solution. There are some terms that you will frequently encountered in the specialized literature. And on the right, we have a systematic overview of the methods we have presented in the context of multi-objective land use optimization. In this way, we conclude the second section. In this third section, we will present very briefly an illustrative and stylized problem that very well represents the type of land use planning problem when it is attempted to be solved with optimization techniques. In this third section, we will present very briefly an illustrative and stylized problem that very well represents the type of land use planning problem when the intention is to solve it with optimization techniques. From the large number of models that have been published recently, we have selected one that is very illustrative of the type of approach that land use planning optimization can solve. In this case, specifically, the objective is to address anticipated climate change. The spatial scale is on the order of 180,000 hectares, and is a case study of regional scope in northern China. The proposed model incorporates two types of constraining factors, the term used by the authors. One is more closely linked to climate change mitigation as a strategy, which seeks to ensure that land use planning maximizes regional carbon storage through sequestration in biomass and soil. The second constraining factor is more closely related to climate change adaptation, as a different from a mitigation strategy, which seeks to maximize a net income function representative of social adaptation throughout the region, while satisfying water availability constraints and respecting land use suitability. The scenarios for which the models have been developed are three well-known scenarios in the context of climate change discussions. The IPCC developed the three emission scenarios used here, and the forecasts are for the year 2050. These scenarios were included in the optimization models, and the names of the three scenarios can be seen here: H2, A1V, and V1. Mathematically speaking, the problem is a multi-objective linear programming problem with two objectives and several constraints, encompassing 6 land uses. To solve it, a scalarization method was used, maximizing a single objective function. The weighted coefficients were then summed and normalized to equalize the impact of the physical units in which the objective function is expressed, one in monetary units and the other in tons of carbon. One of the most important results of this work is presented in Table 7, which we have reproduced in the upper left corner of this slide. As an exercise to better understand the logic of optimization models, we have reproduced, or rather implemented, this optimization model just described in the previous slide in a Jupyter notebook stored in Google Colab. Colab is a free Google service that allows you to write and run Python code in web browsers without having to install software on your computer. In Colab, you can install GurobiPy, a Gurobi library that provides a powerful linear and integer optimization solver. Use of this Gurobi library is covered by a free license, with all the functionality provided in the commercial product, but it only allows solving problems with fewer than 2,000 variables and 2,000 constraints for non-commercial purposes. Therefore, all you need is a Google user and a computer with web access. The link to the Jupyter notebook is indicated on the slide. And after this optimization, table presents the optimal land use allocation for 6 types of land use for the 3 GHG emission scenarios projected for the mid-21st century in each of the last 3 columns of the table. For contrast, the current and actual non-optimized land use for 2010 is also present. The table also presents the results of the objective function and the satisfaction of the predicted water availability constraint. We will provide a Groby implementation of this optimization model that reproduces this table. Finally, in this paper, and without coverage in our exercise, the authors used optimization results to feed an algorithm called cellular automata, which made optimal land use allocations to spatially localized units, producing a raster image of the region that can be displayed as a map. We show one of these products in the slide below on the left. Again, this part of the solution is not provided in our exercise. What is provided is the first part of the work, the optimization part, which is of a more strategic nature than spatial per se. To complete the contents of this presentation, in this fourth and final section, we will introduce some relevant ideas for the analysis of the links that can be drawn between the objectives for sustainable development and land use planning, particularly the contribution that this kind of planning can make to achievement of the SDGs. Just to set the stage, we have included here a definition that was given in the context of the discussions at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, and which was reflected in Agenda 21, an international policy instrument that everyone considers a precursor to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the one which includes the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, and their associated target, which total some 170 in total. This reference was included simply to highlight that the ideas of land use planning, minimizing conflicts, and efficient allocation or trade-off solutions were already part of the environmental concerns of the 1992 Earth Summit. And the last reference remembers us that, as is the case with almost all multilateral initiatives of the United Nations, these solutions must proceed within the context of respect for all components of national sovereignty. We assume here that in other sessions of this Global Campus for SDGs, interesting materials can be found to better understand the structure of the Sustainable Development Goals and their internal coherence. In this chart, which can also be found in the aforementioned work and which we will recommend at the end of this presentation as one of the main texts, you can find an inventory of the links that interest us in this section. To create this chart, the authors selected among the 169 targets planned for the 17 objectives those related to land use planning, either explicitly recognizing that planning plays a role as a process to contribute to achieving the objective, or just implicitly. This differentiation is highlighted in different colors in the chart, but the document also includes a table that clearly displays this graphic expression in textual mode. Here we return to a promising idea that was presented earlier in this session, which is the idea of land degradation neutrality. This concept was developed in the context of the Convention to Combat Desertification. In the reference we offer here, which dates from 2017, we can find the definition of the concept of land degradation neutrality and its connection to ecosystem functions and services and food security, basically, which are the central concerns for the notion of land degradation neutrality. And in this reference, as I said, what we offer is a material where much work has been done on the operationalization of this notion of land degradation neutrality. That is, in trying to turn this expression of desires into a concrete plan that can be taken to the territories and implemented effectively, thus contributing to the fulfillment of Target 15.3 of Sustainable Development Goal 15, which addresses combating desertification and restoring lands, including land affected by land degradation, drought, flooding, etc. Furthermore, in the work, and to be consistent with the global scale of concerns, special attention is paid to the coherence between the implementation or operationalization of land degradation neutrality and the three key conventions of global environmental consensus. Basically, the three signed at the 1992 Earth Summit: the Convention to Combat Desertification, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. In this graphic, the authors present an idea of how land degradation neutrality, the target addressed in Goal 15, can act as an important catalyst for achieving other sustainable development goals, particularly those identified in this graphic, which are goals 1, 2, 6, 7, 12, 13, and 15, hence their importance and centrality. We suggest further analyzing this observation by studying carefully the text. And with this, we conclude our review of land use planning and its relationship to the Sustainable Development Goals. All that remains is to present the bibliographic references. In this very final section of the entire session, we will present the references included in all the previous slides. As we mentioned, all references included throughout the session are compiled in this bibliographic list. However, we point out that those presented in bold typeface on this slide and the next are those that should be considered as basic reading that we recommend for understanding the essence of the issues addressed in this session. In other words, those that we recommend as a roadmap for studying this topic. Here, we simply remind you that the references presented in bold typeface are those that we recommend as basic reading for understanding the essence of the issues addressed in this session. Well, we have come to the end of this session, in which we introduced and reviewed the most relevant issues of land use planning and its contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals, while also adopting an optimization approach to represent and solve typical problems of this issue that is so relevant to mankind in the 21st century. Thank you very much for your attention, and we hope you will be interested in the rest of the sessions of this Global Campus for the Sustainable Development Goals, in which we try to integrally review the contributions of forest landscapes to the SDGs. Thank you very much.